coming up from unpredictable snowstorms swamping the US to Turkey's weirdly warm winter and Australia's severe summer heat wave.
It just cooks you alive out there.
Our changing climate is more evident than ever. But half the world is still less equipped to confront the crisis.
Women start to face gender-based violence in their home.
We delve into this patriarchal issue.
Sometimes families actually give away their girls.
And meet the people unafraid to confront traditions.
It is high time that we recognize women's ways of building power.
It's Just 2 Degrees that's all about women.
I really appreciate your passion on this.
Now,
that is completely out of touch with reality if you see where we are at right now.
The number of men and women in the world is roughly equal, but their access to rights and resources is definitely not. Climate crisis is making these inequalities all the more clear. The World Health Organization says in a natural disaster, women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men. 80% of people displaced by extreme weather are also women.
Tackling climate change means carefully considering why women are so disproportionately impacted by the crisis and how their strengths can be applied to solving it. It's a man's world, as the saying goes, and though times are changing, men still hold way too much power when it comes to policy and practice on local and global issues like climate change. Including women, particularly in regions on the front lines of the crisis, is not just crucial, but smart. Smart doesn't always fly though. While 60% of the world's food is produced by women, they own less than 10% of the land used to cultivate it. In traditional societies, they're expected to cook for their families every day and provide water, which can be a long and treacherous journey in some parts of the world. The lack of freedom in certain household decision-making and additional barriers to accessing resources like loans also place women at a great disadvantage. But women have proven they won't wait for permission to do what needs to be done. In developing countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, women make up around 50% of the agricultural workforce and possess boundless knowledge on water harvesting, food preservation, rationing, and natural resource management. And UN reports have found communities are more successful when women are included in climate planning processes. Let's lay out some stats. Women represent about 43% of the global agricultural labor force. The UN says increasing the number of female farmers will boost agricultural yields by up to 30% and could even reduce world hunger by up to 17%. One study even found that countries with higher female parliamentary representation are more likely to enact environmental treaties, proving that the power of women is no joke.
Well, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified a link between our changing climate and violence against women. Environmental disasters are a threat multiplier for marginalized populations. They lead to displacement, homelessness, poverty, sexual violence, and disease. In parts of the world suffering from water scarcity, women and girls take serious treks, dangerous treks in search of water. And in illegal logging areas, women are the primary target of criminal groups. In 2021, a study was done in Kenya using satellite and national health data. It found that domestic violence rose 70% during extreme weather events like droughts and floods.
So, Doctor, just before your interview now, we ran a bit of information on a study in Kenya that says that domestic violence cases rise during extreme weather events like droughts and floods. What's your response to that?
Basically, what happens when there are extreme events, houses start to go hungry. People have no money for food. And what happens then is, first of all, women start to face gender-based violence in their home. Sometimes families actually give away their girls so that they can get some money to buy food. So there's a lot of child marriages that happen. So this is very, very true.
Of course, there are quite a bit of inequalities when it comes to women's ability to tackle the crisis. How do we even begin tackling those inequalities, like lack of freedom and access to agricultural loans and inheritances?
So first of all, let me say that it's very clear that when there's climate change, when there are disasters, women will always fare worse. And they fare worse for the reason that they actually, because of the gender inequalities that you're talking about, gender inequalities in access to information, access to training, access to resources such as land, such as financial services, or mobility, an inability not being able to move away. So if we're going to address these kinds of challenges, it becomes really important that we start to address these types of inequalities. What that means, and I can explain what that means. The first thing is that we need to know what are the constraints, the hindrances that women face, and what are their priorities. So the first thing to do is to understand what their priorities are and the constraints that they have, so that whatever you're developing is actually geared to removing those barriers. But the other thing that's really important is they need to be participating in leadership in those decisions. They need to be able to be influencing the programs. They need to be able to be influencing the policies. So making sure that you're not just saying we have 100 women in our program, but they are meaningfully involved in shaping the decisions and the programs.
Indigenous women leaders in Africa, Latin America and Asia are among the most vocal on climate action. Many have ancestral knowledge of the environment with traditions that preserve the health of the ecosystems that sustain them. For them, taking action also means the survival of their identities and cultures.
So, hi Lorraine. Based on my research, I find there's not enough respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, nor a true understanding of what the land and nature means to these communities. Do you think you can put this relationship into words?
Thank you very much. Yes, you are very right that there's a general lack of recognition of what a healthy environment, meaning healthy soils, healthy water systems, also adequate in terms of the amount when there are cases of drought, how all these issues affect and are intertwined with women's daily lives, and also aspects on the different components that, how healthy ecosystems are very important for women. And women don't just use nature to produce their livelihoods, but we recognize nature in various facets of our lives from a spiritual perspective, particularly speaking on, me being an African woman who is closely related with my ancestors, their cultural practices. So a clean environment, clean spaces are very, crucial to just our overall well-being. I want to also just point out to some of the facts that a large proportion of livelihoods are derived from the environment, that is from the soil through agriculture, from the water, from our water systems through fishing, and all these components form part of the livelihood of women. And so with these, with a clean environment, with accessible environments that are not affected by, climate disasters, it means that women are able to access their livelihoods, feed their families, because we also get nutrition, household nutrition from the same environment. So definitely, how Indigenous peoples, how in healthy environments and ecosystems, they're really underplayed and they're not really recognized globally, I would say. Even if you look at international processes such as the COP28, I wouldn't say there was much relevance given to Indigenous peoples from Africa. We just held our COP28 assessment, and there were a lot of complaints from our Indigenous folk and women when we had that meeting, saying that, there's just a general assumption, maybe this is politically incorrect, that Indigenous groups only come from probably, other regions in the global south and not from Africa. And so when generally Indigenous people are not recognized, women are at the bottom, especially Black women are at the bottom of the value chain, or, at the bottom of dynamics of politics, which means then women are also not recognized. So, yeah, we need to speak out more on, the role of Indigenous women, how our environments are intertwined with healthy ecosystems, with our lives, whether it's economic, social, cultural, and even spiritual.
You brought up COP28 and you brought me back to that moment when I was there, and I'm always reminded of that second when the COP28 president brought the gavel down, and the first voice in protest against that was an Indigenous woman from the Marshall Islands, and she basically said, our voices were ignored and you guys made a decision on this GST without our input. But where you are in Zimbabwe and across the wider continent, do Indigenous women have the power and autonomy to tackle issues like deforestation and global warming without having to refer to men or get their permission?
Like I said that, I want to first explain the dynamic around the issue of immigration and alternative livelihoods and the disproportionate burden that come from women's gendered roles. So because of other dynamics, whether economically, women are not readily able to migrate and leave their environment, which leaves them to be custodians of the environment, despite the fact that, of course, even some of our land rights don't acknowledge or give access of control and power over our lands and territories. But women still remain, for example, in rural areas, in Indigenous territories, being custodians of the same environment. So women already are protectors of the environment in that regard, that while men, as a result of the climate crisis or looking for other economic opportunities, can readily migrate to urban areas, readily migrate to towns and cities or other countries, women are not able, because they do have that gendered role whereby the family structure, the family unit depends on the women to continuously provide care and sustenance. So definitely this leaves women being custodians and carers of the environment. So yes, women are able to actually, build their power. But I want to point out at how organizing for Indigenous women is very much different from the organizing that happens with, say, national CSOs or regional CSOs or CSOs from the global south. So there's need for that recognition that women can even organize around creation of peace gardens or gardening or, just, other aspects that bring women together. So women have got different spaces through which they organize, different spaces through which they engage in dialogue, they engage in interactions and discussions on issues that affect them, particularly given the climate crisis. And so those spaces have to be given relevance and recognitions and space. And who else is better to articulate issues than the actual victims of the climate crisis, the actual people that are affected by these dynamics? So that is women. So yes, definitely women have the agency, but of course there is just not enough space, and sometimes the way they organize and advocate is not readily recognized. But it is high time that we recognize women's ways of building power, of agency, and also just organizing broadly.
Yeah, you brought up a great point in terms of this this archaic patriarchal system that defines gender roles, which is why women quite often feel as though they are the ones who have to stay at home and tend to the family and make sure the house is still running while the husbands go off and do what they do. One report says Native American and Alaska Native rates of murder, rape, and violent crime are all higher than national averages. Talk about the hardships Indigenous women in Zimbabwe and possibly across the continent face while tackling climate change.
Well, so I want to really articulate sometimes in the environments that Indigenous women and rural women live in. I'll give another example, say in the DRC, whereby, there isn't proper road network systems, there are large forests, right? And sometimes when moving and trying to carry out environmental justice work or organizing, they are met with conditions that are not really, conducive, and which results in abuse of women. And when climate disasters happen and women are displaced from their households. They are forced even to engage, I would say, in various other activities such as sexual work in order to provide for themselves. So it's even, beyond just women being violated in terms of being hit physically, but it also goes down to how their sexuality is affected and how they have to engage in practice that they do not want because they are displaced from their homes. They don't have alternative livelihoods. They don't have alternative ways to earn a living. And that disproportionate burden that is gendered of taking care of children also comes into play, that they have to provide for the children. And so when this happens, it means they're now forced into situations where they have to provide for their families. And even when there's water stress and, our dams dry up and our rivers dry up and our wells dry up, it means that women now have to go further, walk longer distances. And that again places them at risk of violation because they have to get away from their homes, either to access water, to access new spaces for pasture, for their livelihoods, and also even new areas where they can even sell. Because once they produce their crops or other livestock, they want to sell that so that they can earn a living. They have to go further to access markets and all that. So when the climate crisis hits, it produces a series of impacts which then women have to adapt to. And there hasn't been any, support for women to adapt their livelihoods, to adapt their lives when, our forests are destroyed, when, the environment is even destroyed by extractive projects. There isn't that cushion to provide to women, especially women that, don't have other alternatives in terms of the formal education system. Women are already displaced, because of the disproportionate burden again. So when the girl child cannot access again education, then they're forced into, just generally not having access to alternative livelihoods or to be able to move to other regions to seek for work. So then they have to deal with a situation that they did not perpetuate, and they have to live through that. So yes, there are many examples where, women are affected because of the climate crisis, climate disasters, when climate disasters strike and they want to access, services. And when the climate crisis results in excessive drought, I'll talk about what is happening even in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia and Kenya, where it borders. You find that, there has been a recurring drought for the past 4 or 5 years. And, that's a pastoralist community that lives in that region. If you see even at, the conflict even happening in the Sahel, what that means for women. So there are a lot of dynamics and, situations that are happening that are affecting women greatly, that are not being fully addressed or recognized as well.
I really appreciate your passion on this, Lorraine. But we're out of time for this segment. Thank you so much for joining us on Just 2 Degrees. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. And I do hope, we will achieve some change through this discussion.
And young women are at the forefront of mobilizing national and global action movements, often leading the charge on adaptation and justice, like 12-year-old Indian activist Lisipriya Kangujam, who campaigns for action and climate literacy in India. Vanessa Nakate, too, a Ugandan who's led protests in her own country. And there's Greta Thunberg, of course, the Swedish environmentalist known for starting the Fridays for Future strikes.
It's absurd that in an escalating climate emergency when we're already seeing countless of people all over the world lose their lives and livelihoods due to the climate crisis, and we're endangering present and future living conditions to fuel this extreme system that we seem to at all costs want to maintain. It's absurd that in this world airport expansions are even possible and that private jets are even legally and socially acceptable. That is completely out of touch with reality if you see where we are at right now.
Wetland, as the word suggests, is an area of land that's covered by water for either some portion of the year or permanently. Mangroves are an important wetland plant. They're great at capturing carbon emissions, absorbing surges during powerful storms and preventing coastal erosion. Other examples of wetlands include marshes, floodplains, and peatlands, all of which host complicated ecosystems. Well, February 2nd was World Wetlands Day. So why does this day need global recognition, and why do some call wetlands superheroes?
They are incredible superheroes and fascinating superheroes. I mean, these wetlands are very precious ecosystems. If you think that they cover about 6% of Earth, so not a big chunk of the Earth, but they have an incredible value for people and nature, of course. But there is a recent report by WWF that estimated that the water and water-related ecosystems are worth 53 trillion US dollars. This is about 60% of the global GDP. I mean, it's amazing if you think that this is just 6% of the world's surface. So, and the role they play is not just contributing to the GDP and the economy. They also, for example, are a very important barrier to extreme events, right? So they work like sponges. Think about a sponge, a dry sponge, okay? It's tiny, is very flat. When you wet it, it starts absorbing water, right? And it gets larger and it keeps that water, right? Until it gets to a point that it has to release water because it can't absorb it anymore. So they really work as, they are a safety net. When there is too much water, they keep it. And when water is actually needed, they release it, right? So they really play a key role in against these extreme events that we are experiencing more and more because of climate change. They are providing food for people, right? Fisheries is an incredible, has a big economic value in all over the world. They provide water for agriculture. So they are really superheroes.
UN Women says that women in Uganda are leading wetlands conservations there. Do you think there is enough understanding globally about wetlands? Before this interview, I hadn't even given it a second thought. I had to research wetlands, peatlands, marshes, mangroves to some degree. It seems as though there isn't a whole lot of information about wetlands and their importance.
Yeah, absolutely true. That's very true. I mean, information is there, but it's not really mastered by those that make decisions. I mean, people living around wetlands, they do know how crucial wetlands are for their livelihood, but this is not translated into the right decisions at the level of those that makes decisions in terms of preserving and restoring wetlands. So I think that the information is there, but still the understanding is not that deep. Nevertheless, I think things are changing. I was really impressed at the COP28 on climate change in Dubai, where water and water-related ecosystems were actually profiled, and they were recognized as important in the key documents that came out of COP. So I think things are changing. I see the light at the end of the tunnel.
And in keeping with our episode today that focuses on the role of women in tackling the climate crisis, how understated do you think women are in tackling the crisis, considering the inequalities across the globe? Do you think, if given more of an opportunity, that women are the key in beating climate crisis?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if you look at local communities that really live around wetlands and live on wetlands, the role of women is crucial. They are the ones that eventually go get water for the family. They are the ones that use water for washing clothes and many other activities. So I think the understanding of the value of water by women is particularly acute because they live it on their own skin, right? How precious it is to have a well and not walk too far with buckets on their heads in some cases. So when you leave on your skin, the consequences of having abundant and clean resources, you also eventually are capable of making better decisions. So I do believe that women could really have a big impact indeed.
And that's our show. Well, here are images of what's been described as the biggest environmental disaster in Central Asia. The short film, Salty Lives, Women of the Aral Sea, produced by the NGO Aral Dream, features Karakalpak women watching the vast expanse of the sea turned to desert. Millions have lost their livelihoods and suffer as 100 million tons of salty dust from the seabed, spread by wind, erode soil and pollute the air.